The one takeaway every moral citizen of our countries has to have from this is never accept their claims at face value ever again. I'm an Australian. I'm responsible for my country's flaws. That was bad. America invaded Iraq, but China's worse than the Nazis. They are writing our foreign policy. We should stick to Australia's policy and stop following the United States because they want to blow it up by this country. And we have no self-respect, no dignity as a country, because that's what it's come down to. Are we going to be an independent country or not? Politicians, etc., was Muslims and Muslims.
An allegation here that you were rude, offensive, other kinds of claims. Robbie Barwick, I have with us tonight to chat about his Australian Citizens Party. It's got a lot of news over the past few months, even years. It's one of Australia's best-known independent parties, sometimes controversial, often for fairly milquetoast ordinary policies. Other times we see it large viral social media videos. What's to make of all of this? That's what I asked Robbie on, and I'm going to chat to him for the next little while to understand how does a party which seems to talk a lot about economic reform and resources and something so ordinary end up so virally shared on Twitter? Robbie Barwick, thanks for joining me. Robbie, can you hear me?
I can, Chris. How are you?
Robbie, you can't hear me. Good. Did you? Thanks for joining me this evening. I was hoping to chat to you, and I gave you an opportunity to wonder. We've seen so much social media content float around, but your party is something that is many, and yourself would say, is a fairly basic reform party. How do you go from something so, how if I can describe it, as a ordinary policies to something that ends up in the headlines so much? Is it you're being mischaracterized, or is it something more?
Yeah, sorry, I just got something in my eye just then. No, well, I think we're not surprised at the reaction we get, because while our policies may seem ordinary, except in one area, policy area, but our economic policies may seem ordinary to the average Australian, they're actually highly controversial to the political establishment. And because we want to overhaul the way Australia's economy is run, and by overhauling it, you're going to shake up the vested interests who benefit from the current economic system, and they don't like at all what we stand for. So we have some real bitter, implacable enemies in the establishment. And every now and then that spills over into some highly charged attacks on our party. And then when it comes to something like foreign policy, where we are willing to go out on a limb and even defy public opinion on the principles that we hold, then it can get quite willing in that regard, in that sphere. And that's why you'll see some controversial stuff floating around about the Citizens Party periodically.
Tell me, the Citizens Party itself, how many members do you have?
Oh, we've got a few thousand. The way we do our membership is we make sure we've got the signed up membership to register when the registration requirement comes around. We've been registered for 30 years as a political party. Recently, the membership requirement went from 500 to 1,500. So we don't focus all the time on a membership drive. We just do it to make sure we've got the members. We've got a lot more supporters than paid up members. We've got subscribers to our publications, and we've got a fairly large email mailing list that gives us a reach of tens of thousands of people, at least, right across the country. And what we do, which is fairly unique, other parties may be trying to copy it, but they're not as successful as us. We have the best informed support base of any political party in Australia, because we go out of our way to keep them informed, and the most active. We don't want passive supporters, we want active supporters. And so we get our supporters to participate in our campaigns. A lot of our campaigns are focused on lobbying Parliament around policy, and a lot of it comes down to just being prepared to write emails, write submissions on to Senate and parliamentary inquiries, make phone calls to members of Parliament saying this, there's an issue here. I want to express my view on that issue, and be part of thousands and thousands of people that do that. And with that approach, we've actually had a big impact in the last few years. We got policies like bail-in into the public system on the agenda, exposing that. We haven't defeated that yet, but people know about it because of our work. We defeated the push in 2019 to ban cash transactions over $10,000. We were a big part of. There was a broad coalition that did that. But we helped lead it, along with some figures like Adams, the economist, and Martin North, the financial commentator. But it was getting people active and etc. Our party got up the inquiry last year into Australia Post, which would never have happened. I don't like it for the sake of it, because I'm not pandering for votes, but I'm not bragging when I say that inquiry would never happen were it not for our party. We were the only political party in Australia that asked questions done to Christine Holgate and listened to the licensed post office group, which was the people that run the post offices as small businesses, who are her biggest supporters, and said, hang on, she's the best CEO we've ever had. Why has she just been slaughtered political system here? Listen to them. We started publicising what they did. We turned it public around and got an inquiry into that. So the other issue that, I mean, in 4 years, we've got up 6 parliamentary inquiries in Parliament into big issues. And the last one last year was into Sterling First, which was a financial collapse, and it was all about the failings of ASIC. So our supporters have, by working with us and being activists, have helped us do that. And that's, it's given us a reputation. It's made us a force on the political landscape. So, yeah, that's what the Citizens Party has become known for.
You brought up some names like Martin North and John Adams, and these are quite social media forces, at least in they might not be mainstream large, but in a small but significant way in terms of the thought evolution within Australia. And working with them is significant. On the political side, though, these policies have also been picked up by people like Malcolm Roberts and One Nation, which are already an established political party. So these policies would go down a treat at any One Nation meeting. They'd say, oh, well, everything that we can see here, tick, great. Postal bank, audit the banks. One Nation supporters say, great. How does the Citizens Party stand apart from any other party? What's the key differentiator between yourself and any other of these other parties?
Well, first and foremost, we are the intellectual driver of these policies. We get a lot of support and agreement from the other parties because a lot of people find themselves on the same page on an issue like reform of banking now. But what you'll notice if you pay attention to the Citizens Party is we don't ever get off the subject. And these are the subjects we stick to. And a lot of these other parties who talk about a whole host of different things and they're having to, take up lots and lots. They don't have the focus on these policies like we do. But because we have the focus on them, when we get them to a certain point, then these other parties happily get involved because they actually support it. They just don't drive it like we do. And we drive it because we get accused. I mentioned John Adams. He's one of the ones who accuses us of being a think tank, not a political party. I'm happy to compromise and say we're both. We do a lot of work. I'm the research director of our party, right? For 30 years, I've been involved in research into economics and especially Australian history. And so one of the ways that we advocate for our policies, like a national bank, is we don't have to come up with a business plan of how this policy may work. We get to point to the history of Australia and show you how it did work. And we know that subject better than anybody else because we've done, I can't tell you, I can't quantify the amount of time, the thousands of hours I've spent in archives, in state libraries and university libraries, etc., looking at original material that has informed our understanding of the history of Australia, the economic history of Australia, and why we now fight for those policies, which we think we've got to get back to if we're going to once again become successful as an economy. So we do a lot of the work, and then the other parties that have shared views appreciate that, and get involved in our campaign with us. So there's a part of it. But we are unique in many respects. We're hard to pigeonhole. Some people call us right wing. Some people call us left wing. You probably notice yourself that, you might say we're a bit of both. We're not trying to be a bit of both. We don't like the right wing, left wing, chicken wing kind of division. We're just trying to be common sense. But we're willing to take a different view from plenty of these other parties as well on particular issues. And two, I'll say, is our party, because we have a lot of optimism and confidence in how Australia could be successful economically. We're very different to most conservative parties on the issue of refugees and immigration. We think Australia could have a lot more immigration, and we should not be cruel to refugees like we are. We're very opposed to that. That is not a right-wing position. On
immigration, can you go into that in just a couple of lines more detail? When you say a lot more, what does that mean?
Oh, well, the guy who built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Dr. Bradfield, one of our heroes, Australia's greatest engineer, he assumed that by 1990, 30 years ago, Australia would have 40 million people and be well on the way to, if we develop Australia like we could, there's three water catchments in the north of Australia, each of which gets over 20% of Australia's entire annual rainfall, just in those three catchments, and it's not developed, right? So we're called a dry continent, but we're not really. We've got a great big dry part, but if you had economic development, similar to the Snowy Mountain scheme, we could have a lot more population because we have a lot more development. We could be the food bowl for the world in this country, and we would welcome the people who want to come and make a contribution. We could develop, maybe not quite the same as the United States, because they had those big, beautiful rivers flowing through them, like the Mississippi, etc. We don't quite have that, but with infrastructure, we could be a lot bigger than we are. And there's one perspective on it. The man who did a lot to develop Australia himself, Dr. Bradfield, he assumed that we could have 40 million people, and we would minimally agree with that. At least 50 million to 100 million people long term we should be thinking of.
It's estimated that approximately 1/3 of the continent of Africa, if given the choice and cost were no issue, would immigrate to a Western country. That includes Europe, America, Australia in that way as well. So a limit must be at some point, some way of filter. Otherwise, that would bring Australia's population to 400 million people overnight if technology and all those limits were removed. So there must be some limit. I mean, who of that limit? How would you there must be some way to pick and choose who would get to come, and how do they get to be chosen, assuming that limit does get increased?
Well, I think the people who want to come to a country, Australia, to be the people who value Australia the most. So it gets pretty dicey when you put too much stock in that. And by the way, I would question the premise of your question there, Chris, because you can say it is estimated that. Yeah, well, we're saying what I've just told you about Australia's potential is premised on development. If Africa had kind of development in Africa, where their living standards are raised, why would 1/3 of them want to emigrate? The people if their living standards are improving, people aren't inclined to immigrate. So you have what Africa's potential is. Lake Chad is a very dry lake now, but just like we advocate the Bradfield scheme of Queensland to turn the roots inland and south to water our dry interior. There's a big project idea to divert Congo River or part of the Congo River up into Lake Chad and bring life back into that part of North Central Africa, right? And create
to bring it back to Australia, though. There's always going to be a limit of some kind, and more people every year forever have wanted to come to Australia than can come, and all I was able to get there was the people who love Australia most would come. How would you pick and choose, or how would you change the current selection process to be something different when it came to immigration? How would you approach that?
Right now we have a population Ponzi. So and I agree with the people who criticise the current high levels of immigration in Australia, because all is premised on is this wealth effect down idea that if we just bring in floods, we keep the demand for housing high, and that keeps house prices going up. That keeps the banking on higher and higher house values, and that creates a wealth effect that trickles down. That's crazy. After our biggest burst in immigration relatively was after World War II, but we brought in, we dared to bring in massive amounts of immigration because that was our biggest development phase as an economy. We needed those people. There's a lot of European refugees that lived in Tasmania, building Tasmania's amazing hydro electricity system, right? It's a stunning system what they've got down there. A lot of them came to mainland Australia to work on the Snowy Mountain scheme, and then stayed and worked that flourished on the back of that. So that's what we would go back to. Have the vision for economic development.
Robbie, I'm not sure how. On the one hand, we can have I'm not sure how we can have a policy on one hand which is for increasing immigration and speaking of population numbers of 40 million plus, while at the same time criticizing the current migration scheme which as a population Ponzi. Is that I'm getting mixed messages whether that's for increasing immigration, reducing immigration.
They're not doing it to actually develop Australia. They're doing it to create demand for a housing bubble. The housing bubble, in our view, is the biggest cancer in our economy. Since the year 2000, our whole economy, we've trashed manufacturing. We don't care about agriculture. It's houses and holes, as some commentators put it. We've got two tricks to the economy: mining and a housing bubble. Everyone's screaming about how housing is unaffordable, and these bastard governments are doing everything in their power to keep it up, including floods of immigration. Now, I'm happy with the floods, but only if they're coming in here to develop Australia, not to become extra demand to be crowded into suburbs on the fringes of Melbourne and Sydney, right? To create extra demand for housing. The banks can keep lending for housing. The banks in 1990, Chris, the banks lent 70% of their lending went to business and 30% to mortgages. Now it's reversed: 30% to business and almost 70% to mortgages. They're like the banks before 2008 in America. All they're doing is making money out of betting on housing, and the governments are helping them with this high immigration program. So now the housing is going down. What's Albo said? We're going to bring.
If I can do I try not to do these, but if I can do so what you're saying, I try not to do these. What you're saying is that our current immigration is based upon investors migrating to Australia, demand based, if I'm interpreting you correctly, and that you're criticizing the large fringes of Sydney and Melbourne being populated, or many people coming to Australia who are not coming to work, labor, contribute. And you were speaking of Tasmania, where people were building construction. And your criticism is
you're not going to get. No, I'm not criticizing the immigrants work. They come here and they come here to work, but they're working in activity that's stimulated by their very presence of being here. Hang on, have you lost me?
I'm still here. You're just breaking up a little bit, and I'm checking my link, but we can hear you. It's okay.
All right. No, I was just checking that. They're working in service jobs that are stimulated by their very presence of being here. But if we were developing as a country, where you didn't look at a map of Australia, they can produce these maps of Australia, Chris, where they show they color code it based on population growth or population decline, and most of Australia is some shade of population decline. we could be having large population increase in this country, but if it's here, if it's being brought in for economic development purposes and it's spread out across the country so that all the regional towns and all the small towns are growing incrementally, right? And you're not crowding them into 1 or 2 or 3 big cities like we're doing at the moment, it would be a world of difference. The experience people have would be much different than what we're having now. That's what we need to create. You've got to have an intention for economic development first. The people who come in will want to work. They're here to make a difference. It's up to the government to have the vision to say, okay, we could, if we have the intention to develop Australia, there's plenty of people around the world who'll want to help us do that. And
Robbie,
and we need to bring back our own fertility rate, of course, as an economy, which is woeful, right? Let's get natural fertility up as well.
fertility rates. Let's take a break for just one moment and reset our internet connections, and we'll come back in just 5 minutes. We're back, and Robbie's rejoined from his phone after an internet connection blip, but he was in the middle of talking about what some would call a right-wing talking point, which was fertility rates, something that maybe One Nation or even as further right than that would be talking about. But you're talking about something while you're also supporting immigration. You're also talking about the concern about Australia's falling and below replacement level fertility rate as well. You're smashing together and almost contravening, some would say. These are left and right wing talking points. Can you walk and chew gum at the same time?
Well, I don't know why there is a contradiction. I don't see them in that way. I don't see them as left or right. But there's a falling fertility problem in many countries around the world, and we sheet it home to economic pessimism and economic conditions. And because if people were in better economic conditions and enjoying economic progress, they would be more inclined and more free to enjoy having families, and the fertility rate would naturally rise. But it's almost a cliche, but people do talk about there was a time when one wage could look after a whole family. In fact, Australia invented the concept of the living wage over a century ago in the Sunshine Harvester case. A single wage that could look after a family. Family life was very important, but now economic conditions are such that people are debt slaves and they're chasing money, but not in a greedy way, out of desperation. They need to work very hard to keep their head above water just to be able to put a roof over their head, which is why I called the property bubble a cancer on our economy, Chris. Right? So if we could solve that, if we could stop having a property bubble, and we could have an economy where the wealth of the economy came from people working in wealth creating industries, to like manufacturing and agriculture, etc., to create wealth, rather than an economy based on hoping that asset values will go up like housing, and then then the wealth effect will trickle down. So if we can go back to that model that we once used to enjoy and we're very, very good at, then we're confident we can bring our fertility rate back up, so that it's at least above replacement. And we can look to a lot of prosperity for the future that a lot of people can share in.
These economic policies will win you support from the left and the right. But one policy is probably what you're most well known for, one stance. And that inevitably, the most well-known topic or reputation that your party has is around China. A lot of people say that you stand for and you're around a lot of things on China, whether it's domestic or foreign policy. Here's a chance. What is the Citizens Party? Reflection, position, whatever you want to call it, policy. What do you say when it comes to China?
Well, we're the only party, this does distinguish us from all others. We are the only political party in Australia pushing back against the disinformation that we fear is leading us to war with China. Now, I'm very confident, Chris, the day war is declared, the vast majority of Australians will suddenly be on our side. They'll go, oops, we don't want that, because it's unthinkable. We'll never win it. It'll be a war of annihilation. It is insane. But what's happened, all wars are paved, the road to all wars is paved with disinformation. What's happening at the moment is there's a lot of disinformation out there that people are being fed, and unfortunately they're lapping it up, because it is easy to be prejudiced against a country like China, not just because they're communist, but because there's 150 years of a certain deep-seated psychological fear that has been expressed in Australia, the yellow peril fear, where, you know, we're a white country in an Asian region, that we're going to be invaded. This sort of thing has never happened, except it came very close by the country that we're now best friends with, and whose prime minister, who was just assassinated because of the weird church he was involved in, and we've just sent 4 ex-PMs to his funeral as a tribute to him, who was a denier of that country's war crimes. That's Shinzo Abe denied his country's war crimes. My grandfather fought in the Kokoda Track to defend Australia from the invasion of that country. The biggest victim of those war crimes was China. We are cutting Japan all the slack in the world because we say they're a democracy, yet the country that we were an ally with in that war, who hasn't invaded us, who is our best customer, suddenly everything they do is being absolutely demonized. And so we're trying to say to people, well, look at each case and see the truth in each case. But also, so we can go through those cases.
Let's come back from Japan and put Japan to the side for a little bit. There's great points that you made there.
That's a contrast.
You got some contrast and context, but the question came back to what's the party's position on China, and I'll narrow it down further to the party's position on what is ruling the media headlines and diplomatically raising hairs. Taiwan. Does the party have a position? Do you have a view or position on Taiwan?
Our position is the Australian government's position since 1972, except the Australian government wants to play games and justify the United States trying to blow that position up. We still hold to the position we expressed in 1972, which is that there is one China, and we acknowledge that Taiwan is a province of China, and we are moving our diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to Beijing because that's our position. You know, we made that we gave China that recognition in 1972, Chris, because we wanted to open up a relationship with China. We saw the benefit in opening up the relationship with China. The whole world did. In fact, this is one thing we led the United States on at the time, but the United States also wanted to do it. They had their own reasons for wanting to do it. Part of that was trying to split up the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists. But China had one condition for opening up, which was it said to the world, you have to acknowledge there's one China, and Beijing, the People's Republic of China, is the one China, and we all agreed to that. And that's still our position today. But the United States from 2011, in a significant way with what's called the Asia pivot, but then 2016, 2017, decided.
I'll take us away from the United States, because then we get into a
no, you can't. No, you can't, because that they are writing our foreign policy. That is our issue. Is we should stick to Australia's policy and stop following the United States because they want to blow it up. It's not in our, whatever the United States wants to do with China, it's not in our interest. And that's why we have to talk about the United States, because we have a policy, we haven't changed it. We are not talking about it though, because we're so subservient. We are like a bull with a ring through its nose being led around by this country, and we have no self-respect, no dignity as a country where we're willing to stand on our own 2 feet. That's why we have to talk about the United States whenever we talk about China, because that's what it's come down to. Are we going to be an independent country or not?
Let me bring it to domestic policy when it comes to China. A lot of concern has been raised about our foreign influence of China on Australian politics, on Australian culture, on Australian values, and on Australia. And certainly is something I've seen firsthand here as well. This isn't, while I'm sure a lot gets made of it in media, because that's always very tasty, is something I've seen firsthand here. And it's a concern not just the people in my community here around Eastwood have, but I have as well. It's not. Is this something that you recognize, good or bad, is happening, that you can see that China is?
There's nothing China that's doing that's any different than what any other country ever does in that regard. All countries use soft power diplomacy and to cultivate good relations. All countries definitely use their diasporas to cultivate good relations. China does exactly the same thing. No more, no less. Yet when it's doing it, it's being...
I'm yet to see any parts of Australia that have American or Texan politicians speaking that they need to stop listening to all the Australian voices and only listen to American voices. I'm yet to see any British politicians for a long, long time now. It's a long, long time since Britain has attempted to overtly or out loud attempted to influence our politics here. So maybe it's happening behind closed doors, but in council meetings, on street corners, this is happening here, and I'm saying it at first hand. So to say it's nothing different.
No, you just, well, you will see every politician in Australia that has a sizable ethnic minority in their electorates from any country will suddenly find themselves agreeing with the position of that ethnic minority on their country, and for better or for worse. So, for instance, I'll give you a few that I know. John Alexander, the former Liberal member for Bennelong, tennis player, he was a big champion of having the Armenian genocide acknowledged as a genocide. Do you know why he was, Chris? Because he had a big
Sarkis Udelian advocated, and there's a significant Armenian. Absolutely, you're right.
A few years ago, I went to a Diwali, however you pronounce it. I apologise to the Indian community for not pronouncing it correct. Celebration in Canberra, in the Marble Hall of Parliament House. It was huge. I couldn't believe the lineup of politicians to come and speak to the Indian community. Do you know why? Because it's the fastest growing ethnic community in Australia, and it is huge. And all these politicians are coming along, and they will be very influenced by the views of that community on certain things. Another example that's far more striking is I saw a video in 2013 of Anthony Albanese addressing an event in his electorate where he actually essentially, this is for interpretation, he sided with the Assad regime in Syria. Now, he didn't really, but what he did was he basically said that all the carrying on by our government and our media about Assad must go was inappropriate, and Syria should make its own decisions. Now, for him, I was rather shocked when he did that, because that was a rather brave. I agree with his position, but it was a rather brave position for him to make. The only reason he made it is because he has a very large Alawite Syrian community in his electorate, and so and then, please, in terms of the British, that is the default position in Australia. The British don't have to do these things that you react to by the Chinese community, because that's the default position. The Queen is she was our Queen. The King is our King, for crying out loud, right? They've got everything is in their favour. One of the ways that showed up is in the hysterical media reporting for the last 10 years on Chinese investment in Australia. Chinese investment in Australia never got to any more than 10% of what the British have, and about and even less than that of what the Americans have of this country. Yet every time some Chinese business interest bought something, and they're number 10 on the list as well, their investment is smaller than Belgium and even Luxembourg. Yet every time a Chinese interest bought something in Australia, hysterical headlines, oh, the Chinese are buying us up. It was never even close. Yet the same people never talk at all about how much of our country is owned by the United States and the United Kingdom. A massive amount of our country is owned by those two countries, and it just doesn't get commented on. China does get singled out.
excellent points relevant to each individual area, but again, with the reputation of the Citizens Party on China, the point I raised firsthand, not blown out of proportion, that I witnessed, again, firsthand to you, not blown out of proportion, was one of the leading Chinese nationalist figures, or Chinese figures, Councillor Simon Zhou, advocating for his community to stop listening to the other voices and focus on ourselves. And I'll repeat that again because I have not seen any Texan, Scottish, English. I would suggest.
I think that's No, well, I think that's something that he chose to. I don't know who Simon Zhou is. That's actually something that's unique about our party as well. We've taken a position on China that's not influenced by having Chinese members. We've got hardly any Chinese members. The Chinese support we've got is only come because we've been saying what we've been saying about the war danger, because a lot of Chinese Australians share the concern about the war danger. But different politicians act different ways to get to achieve their objectives in politics. Some of them say all sorts of outlandish things. Do Australian Chinese politicians, or do some Australian Chinese politicians do that as well? I'm sure they do, like every other community. My objection is to singling them out as if this is one entity that is worse than all the rest. I reject that outright.
I haven't seen any other community act in this way, and the turnout in the room for support for him from the Chinese Australians was overt, large signs. Again, I haven't seen any other Armenian community. While there have been protests, there's no other community I've seen anything like this.
Well, have you got around everywhere? I mean,
within this community, there's plenty of multiculturalism here, but they're the only group that acts in this behavior, and it's a great example.
Okay, that's your perspective. That's your perspective, and that's fine. But I don't think it's not convincing.
It's one example of a repeat pattern that people have raised as concerns, and has raised concerns on this topic.
But does it have anything to do with the fact that our media has been drumming into us non-stop that there's a book written in 2018 called Silent Invasion of Australia, which said without any proof that 40% of Chinese are loyal to Beijing and not to Australia? And this was a book written by an academic, and who's supposed to have proof for some sort of statement like that. He doesn't say it. And this is what's been dripped into people's heads, and suddenly everything. I mean, I've got Muslim friends who have told me, man, we're now relieved that all the heat's gone off the Muslim community in the last few years because it's suddenly all in the Chinese community. And the fact that it's shifted so suddenly, Chris, this is what we want people to think about. This has been a sudden shift. For 15 years, the hysteria, all the right-wing politicians, etc., was Muslims and Muslims, 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 Muslims. When you talked about me raising fertility rates, as you know, that could have been thought to tie in with this fear that it's the Muslim countries that are breeding and they're going to come and outbreed the world and all that sort of stuff. Which it's got nothing to do with why I raised it, but that was the kind of stuff getting around there. That's what dominated social media in the last few years. That's switched. It switched to China. Everything Chinese is now demonized, and the reason for that switch, you don't have to believe me. You can disagree with me, but I'm telling you what I know. The reason for that switch is because US foreign policy shifted and Australia is expected to go along with it. And the way they make Australia going along with it is the media, which is controlled by 3 entities in this country, including the man who should be in jail for helping start the Iraq war, the Murdoch media, the ABC, which is state media. When it comes to foreign policy, absolutely state media. And now Channel 9, run by Peter Costello, whose father-in-law was one of the influences behind a regular event called the Australian American Leadership Dialogue, where every year Australian politicians and American politicians get together and the proceedings are secret. We are not allowed to know what they talk about. And every year, these people have their big confabs to make sure Australia stays in lockstep with the foreign policy of the country that keeps getting us into wars. That media, that three-pronged media, have been spewing out all this anti-China stuff. It does influence the way people think, and what you get is suspicion on the Australian community side, and then defensiveness on the Chinese side, because they're thinking, why are we being singled out all of a sudden? And I'm trying to get people to look at the bigger picture and say, why did this sudden shift happen? And it's not because the Chinese Australians suddenly started doing something different than they've been doing all along.
I'll leave it with that one because I want to move on to one final one. one of the most viral videos that anyone's ever seen your face was what's happened with Vicky Shu. And I'll bring it up. While I'd like to allow the opportunity here to tell us what happened here, because we all saw, thousands, I think millions of us saw what happened here, where you asked a question about the effectiveness of the Uyghurs for sale and identify manufacturing companies have stopped using Uyghur labor because of your report. And then the question is, what happened after that? What did we see before you got to this meeting? Because there's an allegation here that you were rude, offensive, other kinds of claims. What happened before this meeting? Because she then replies something which I'd like you to address here, of what happened where she says that you were rude. What happened there?
Well, a year earlier, I'd had an exchange with her on social media, and she didn't like what I said, but on Twitter, people can be quite willing. And she called me. Am I allowed to swear on your show, Chris? She called me a stupid, bald old fuck, which maybe I am. The only part of that I took that I was insulted by was the word old, because that catches up when you're at a certain point. You don't like to think you're old. That was in 2020, and then in 2021, I just happened to be on the same plane with her coming back from Canberra. And when I got off the plane, I was at the taxi rank at Melbourne University, and I was first in line because it was the middle of the day. There was no one there. And Vicky came and stood at the spot next to me, and I took the opportunity to introduce myself as the man she'd called the stupid, bald old fuck. And then we had an exchange about, I tried to explain to her what motivates me. I said, do you understand that people like me don't want, the reason we do what we do is we don't want war with China. And she then said, I'm at war with China. And I said, no, a real war with China. And she said, I'm in a real war with China. And then at that time, the taxis came, and I said, good luck tonight on Q&A, because I knew she'd been promoted as coming down for Q&A. And we got in our cabs, and that was it. And I tweeted about that exchange, about her saying that she's at war with China. So that was her experience with me, right? Thanks to having met me at the airport. And I will note, though, Chris, that night on Q&A, she was on there to talk about being harassed online, and she did not give the example of the meeting with me at the airport that day. Yet what she does in this exchange here, back in August, at the Latrobe Asia event in Melbourne, is she used that incident, she misrepresented it, and she used it as the excuse not to answer my question. And my question was rather...
That's true. I will note quite clearly there, she didn't answer the question. That is an important part there. And even if you had, as she claims, ambushed her, something a pet hate I have of mine is to not answer the question. If Vicky, if you do end up watching this, because you're probably tracking what Robbie does, it's up to you how you answer that question. There's some questions that I've asked Robbie here tonight that are difficult. He might be the worst person in the world, but he's answered them, sometimes at times fiery. Great, good on him. But he hasn't instead said that I've tried to ambush and attack him. That's up to him to try and defend or answer the question the best way he can. So this goes for anyone that I hope I do, if you're watching this and you get to ask you these questions, Vicky, is it's up to you how you answer it. You can try and create that this is a parasocial relationship behind it, as an interviewer asking. But ultimately, we do want to know what the answer is. And so often I'm trying to press, as I have Robbie and I hope others, I'm trying to press them for what it is behind it. So, and that's something I also give some credit here. If I can bring up one of the, Drew had just been arrested outside Eastwood for a stunt. It was a complete stunt. And I asked him some difficult questions in part of this, and he did pretty well. And he was feeling the pressure of it, and he did well in just answering the question. He didn't start, anyone else probably would have started throwing it back at me and saying, "Oh, what are you doing asking this question?" Because I was suggesting to him that he caused a stunt, because that was a fair allegation by many, that he'd gone to Eastwood to cause a stunt. Back to the topic of China. So Vicky didn't answer the question. She made it personal, and we just ended up looking at it and wondering, what's the truth here? What's the truth? Because
Well, and
Rob
that's
Robbie is the answer to this.
and I think I was a red herring because my question is, which is rather bland in some respects, was just about she wrote a report in 2020 for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute alleging forced labour by the Uyghurs, China subjecting Uyghurs to forced labour. And I wanted to know if she was happy to stand by that report to the extent that she would take credit for Uyghurs having lost their jobs. Because I'm working with people who want to sue the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on behalf of those Uyghurs who have lost their jobs, because thanks to the cancel culture that we're all so familiar with, this cuts both ways, and there's been a campaign in the last 2 years to get companies that get cotton from Xinjiang to stop getting that cotton, sourcing that cotton from there, on the grounds that it might have involved Uyghur forced labour. And consequently, a lot of Uyghurs have lost their jobs. And I just did an interview with a woman who wrote the report that I've got in my hand there in that picture, Jack James, who subjected Vicky Shu's report to legal analysis and showed that of the 18 allegations they made, they didn't have any evidence for any of them. And this
Robbie,
has
if I can
been...
ask something about your question here, is even if she may not know the specific holding company in the specific town in the specific place of what was happening, if we can take anything else in a different place, something can still occur, and there can be still evidence of that. Well, not that I'm alleging to have that, but that an event can still be happening reasonably well documented, which I'm not purporting, but many other articles, many other media organizations have said that could still be happening, even though Vicky doesn't know the address and holding company name on the spot. That can still be happening, right?
Well, that would apply to plenty of other people, but not to Vicky Shu and ASPI, because if you know the way the anti-China media circuit globally has worked for the last 3 or 4 years, is because ASPI is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and that sounds like a very official name, they make claims about China that get reported around the world as if they are fact. So Vicky's report became the basis for all the reporting around the world that China is using forced labour. So and we know that to be true, it's her report and her ASPI report that was the basis for this whole thing. And so if someone needs to know the details, Chris, it's her. And she didn't want to answer that question. So, and that confirmed to us in our mind, and certainly in my mind, that she didn't like having her claims and the ASPI report's claims subjected to real scrutiny, because the media didn't give it any scrutiny. It served their purpose. And can I just make a point here? You know, you raised Drew. I'm one of Drew's fiercest critics, but one of the points, he was the first person to insult me by calling me old on social media. So I'm starting to get the message.
Is that an unfair criticism? Is that like
No,
all the insults that you send on social? Is that?
It's funny. It's funny that it hurts me so much, just because I've been in politics since I was young, and you don't like to think you're getting old. But okay, I accept I'm getting older. But one of the things
I would say, if someone's calling you old, that is the most polite level of discourse you're going to have on social media. So I'd almost take that as a compliment on Twitter, mate. So that's a great compliment for Drew, because there's a lot of that. So good on Drew for keeping it polite, given that there might be some other ideological differences that the two of you have. So. But
it cuts both ways, because what I said to Drew is, because when he was literally a baby, 1 year old or whatever he was, I was fighting to stop the Iraq War, and what I learned from that experience was that our side, the goodies, when I played soldiers with my brothers on our farm, right, the Germans and the Japs were the baddies and we were the goodies. What I learned from that experience is our side, the goodies, the Brits, the Americans, the Aussies, were prepared to deliberately make up lies in order to invade a country and start a war that killed 1 million people. And they're all the politicians involved in it are now screaming about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, which is a fraction of what we did to Iraq. They've thrown sanctions on Russia, sanctions on China for what they alleged China. No politician's been held accountable for that Iraq war crime. The guy who blew the whistle on it is rotting in Belmarsh prison in the United Kingdom. At this level, our side is not just lacking in moral authority, sorry, we are the bad guys. The Iraq War proved it. And I don't have all the control I'd like to have over the world, but what I did vow from that time forward is I would never, because when they were saying weapons of mass destruction, Chris, I couldn't say in 2002 there were no weapons of mass destruction. How would I know, right? So all I could say is you have no evidence of that. But when the evidence came out that there were no weapons of mass destruction and they had actually sexed up the intelligence and effectively made it up, that's why I thought, okay, the one takeaway every moral citizen of our countries has to have from this is never accept their claims at face value ever again. You must demand the highest standards of evidence for these kind of claims that could lead us to a war. And yet what we're having with China now is a repeat. Wild claims thrown out there that only catch on because they're repeated ad nauseum, and when we subject them to a modicum of demand for evidence, they fall apart. And the Uyghur issue is one of those.
Leaving the Iraq War aside, wars and empires have flaws. All empires do have flaws. You've highlighted many of them in, shall we call, the West. But I've highlighted a few of them, and Drew often highlights a few of them of China. Can you recognize that China has flaws? And as any large empire, group of nations, whatever you want to call it is,
yeah, but we don't.
When I've put them to you've refuted them and spoken about other flaws, which absolutely Iraq War was a huge mistake, not just a mistake, a catastrophe. Everything that you spoke about, yep. But when I've put some of these same problems and issues, for example, the reunification of Taiwan or other issues, that you refuted them. So it comes off as we're only going to speak about one side's flaws, but not the others. As true as the Iraq War and many of the faults of the West.
Okay, I'm an Australian. I'm responsible for my country's flaws, and what we're told about China is not that it has flaws like every other country. Andrew Hastie in 2019 compared them to the Nazis. We are told that this is the worst regime since the Nazis. And so I'm subjecting those claims to actual evidence, because the counterfactual is, which nobody can deny, is this is a country that has improved out of sight over the last 40 years in terms of living standards of its people. It's lifted nearly 1 billion people out of poverty. Most of the rest of the world, 140 countries have signed the Belt and Road Agreement. They're lining up to do deals with China because it's the economic success story of the world. And what motivates a country, the leadership of a country, to focus so much on improving the lives of its citizens that way? That is not an evil country. You could convince yourself, if you choose to, that China's so evil that the only way it can hide it is to make sure everything it does is good. But that's just to hide the fact that it's so evil. Well, I think, no, that's rubbish. They're trying to do their best as a country. They should be judged on their results. And one of the reasons that our party is enthusiastic about China is because economically we have a lot to learn from what China has done. It has worked. And then, because we know Australian history, we point out, well, hang on, what it has done is repeat in its country what we used to do here. We used to have the same kind of approach of using public banks to invest in large-scale infrastructure development that stimulated industries and raised living standards. That's what we used to do. We stopped doing it in the last 40 years. The Chinese started doing it. It's worked brilliantly for them. They're sharing it around the world with their Belt and Road project. It doesn't deserve to be demonized, so we should applaud them for that. But if I come across as sounding like I'm biased towards China, it's because I will not stop. I will not tolerate people saying to me, "Oh yeah, you got to criticize them all equally." Yeah, but what they mean by that is say, "Oh yeah, that was bad. America invaded Iraq, but China's worse than the Nazis." No.
Can I try some element of cross and some bipartisanship then? Drew Pavlou, one of your fiercest critics, was recently the victim of an email hoax where emails were sent to embassies and other authorities falsely claiming that he was going to, falsely sending bomb threats saying that Drew was going to bomb things up. Can I at least ask for some level of recognition that framing, a condemnation of that framing?
Well, I don't think. I'm happy to say I genuinely don't think Drew sent bomb threats, and it therefore is a hoax. But who am I to condemn? Because I certainly reject his insistence with zero evidence that it's the Chinese framing him. He has no evidence of that. He might be right, but I tell you, he's got zero evidence of it. Yet he has, as what he normally does, he doesn't just allege the Chinese have framed him. He alleges, like he did in Eastwood, that just like the Chinese Communist Party controlled the New South Wales police, who had the gall to arrest him for saying Xi Jinping fucks your mother, and upset a lot of people in Eastwood, naturally, which you yourself knew would upset them. He's now alleging
it was going to upset them. I didn't know what it said to begin with. Before you say I knew it would upset them, I didn't know it was going to lead to that, and I didn't know what it said until I got the subtitles wrong. So I'll refute that straight away. But please continue.
He's now alleging the Chinese Communist Party controlled the London Metropolitan Police. This is a guy who's been so brainwashed on this China question. He's so the McCarthyism around China. McCarthy was that crazy American senator who saw the commies are everywhere. Commies are here, commies are there, commies are there. Drew has adopted exactly the same worldview when it comes to China. But he's now alleging the London Metropolitan Police are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party because of the way they treat him and the gall that they had the gall to arrest him. So yes, I do accept that he wouldn't have been stupid enough to send a bomb threat. That's crazy. Not to the point I'd be a character witness, because but I strongly suspect that's the case. I don't think Drew operates that way, but I got nothing. Whoever did it should be condemned, but he's got no evidence that it's China who's doing it or that China controls those police forces.
A little bit of bipartisanship. There you go. Condemning fake bomb. It's something. It's something. I'll take it. It's a fierce ideological battle over the future of Australia. The two of you have audiences that listen to what you have to say. But there you go. Some ideological alignment. You're on the same side. No fake email bomb threats. Great.
That's right.
We'll leave the rest for another time. But Robbie, thanks for your time this evening. I hope we get to speak again. Australian Citizens Party.
Thanks, Chris.
They've got a YouTube channel. Speak about what they have there, and yeah, go from there.
No, thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks for your time. See you, Robbie.
All right. See ya.
Some closing thoughts, having spoken with Robbie Barwick of the Citizens Party. I've been following the issue for quite a while. Moved back to Australia in 2018, having lived around the world for 10 years. What I found was a community vastly different from the ones I'd visited even in 2013. The people had changed, the languages had changed. I had found it struggle to try and speak to people in my own street where I grew up. It was difficult. It wasn't that they couldn't speak English, so they didn't want to. I'd lived in other countries. You get your phone up and you do the translate, even on my old iPhone 4 in South America, and you try. Here they didn't want to. And I started asking questions. How did we get here? The answers I found with Simon Zoe were they're happy in their community, in their bubble. And they're happy in their bubble because they've got the backing and support of a foreign nation that says, yeah, go, do this, create this bubble. And politicians like Simon Zoe who are more than willing to stand up for it and say it. On the other side, a lot of what Robbie Barwick says is right. It's true. The Iraq War was a catastrophe, and we don't raise enough the reason to send hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths over a war that they may have had anyway eventually, but over a war whose pretense was false. And we may be rushing into another one. For what gain? For what cause? For what principle? His economic policies shouldn't be controversial, but it's his Chinese policies that are. Robbie strikes me as a guy that looks at Australia somewhat the same way I do. Except it's the banks that have been ripping billions out of Australia, the regional towns that aren't getting the economic development. If the rest of his policies weren't there, he'd be seen as a far-right Fraser Anning. But he's not. And honestly, a lot of people who are described as far-right these days aren't either. Robbie Barwick is a guy who cares about the people who are here, the Australians that are here, people who are loyal to the principles of this country and this nation. And he pushes away from the people who've lied to those same people over time. Doesn't make everything he's saying right. But he spoke to me. He answered questions. He evaded some of them, but most of them, he was straight up with it. He brought up some good points. Was there whataboutism? Plenty of it. Everyone does. Everyone does. We face a future, Robbie's right about this, wedged between an America that seems willing to push us into a war in Ukraine and Taiwan, and a China that seems almost keen to do the same over Taiwan. But his point that we have recognised, the Australian government recognised Taiwan as part of China back in 1972. It's a great point. We did. All of it's so hard to try and decipher and put in a box. He's a pro-China shill. Maybe. Probably. There's a lot of money that goes into his party that we don't know where it comes from. But it's never that simple. The rest of it just isn't there. Simon Zoe I'll push into that box, but not him. It's easy to push Drew Pavlo into another one, whipped up into a frenzy. Maybe. Student activist gone wild. Sure. At the end of it, you kind of look around and go, you've got to look beyond the people that are asking you for $1. You've got to look beyond the people who are putting their hand out and saying who can profit from it. And on that point, Robbie's probably right. But China might be willing to get some money out of him just as much as anyone else. And it's that ideological win which might be more valuable than any trade or anything else at all. And those conflicts can be diffused or not fought over before they're even fired. There's my view. I enjoyed speaking with him. I'm glad he did, and that says something that he's willing to. He's no Daniel Dumbrill. He's also no other type of pro-China allegation that way. He's trying to look out for what he sees as his people. Kind of a remnant, a defender of empire and country long past that doesn't exist anymore because it got lied to about Vietnam, it got lied to about Iraq. And, well, if they're just going to lie to it, and if the banks are just going to rip you off, why not look at someone who's actually, by comparison to the rest of it over the past 4 years, acted in good faith? It doesn't make it perfect faith. Nothing about China certainly is. Nothing about a large country could be called particularly good faith. Some better than others, without a doubt. But given it's our largest trading partner, why not look at that and cut out the middlemen? Cut out the rubbish banks who were just profiting. Cut out the Gina Reinhardts who were taking what Wilcannia, Broken Hill, what the Kimberleys should be getting their fair of resource profits, but are just going into Gina's pocket. There's elements of that where he just wants to cut out the Macquarie Street traders and politicians profiting off the guys who are digging the rocks out of the ground. The Stuart Bonds who labour for what it might be a very well paid $180,000 a year, I estimate, but aren't getting a share, aren't getting an actual share of what those profits might be. Norwegian style, a sovereign wealth fund where this tiny nation ends up owning big percentage points of the world. Instead, we have our twiggy forests ending up with what those workers should have. Stuart Bonds even thinks of a certain degree of truth in what Robbie's saying, and we've got to try and navigate what he's saying of what is true and what benefits someone else. Because all of these activists that you'll see between Drew and Robbie, there's always a message that's also that's going to benefit someone behind them. We've got to work out what that is. Talking to them is probably better than the alternative. But it still ends up, if you're anything like me, walking away wondering, What do you do with it all? Watch it, work it out, learn. Keep asking questions. Thanks for watching.